After owning this car for a few years now, I only recently realized that I never actually showcased the car here on YouTube besides a couple of short videos. The only times I talked about it is either to people I've met in real life or on Discord. This is my 1981 Datsun 280ZX. It's a base model car with only a couple of options, that being an AM/FM stereo and air conditioning. The snowflake rims were added later by the original owner. The original owner was a college professor who barely drove it except for on sunny weekends. When it came time to replace the clutch, he was getting older and didn't feel like spending the money, so he decided to sell it to his mechanic. His mechanic was a Datsun dealership master technician since the early 70s, and he knows those cars like the back of his hand. Well, in 2019, I started working for that mechanic, and I knew right then and there, the first time I saw it, that I wanted to buy it. For almost 2 years, I worked really hard to save up my pennies, and finally, in November of 2021, I purchased a car from my boss for just under $8,000. It was an absolute steal, even though the car wasn't perfect, at least in my OCD brain. There were a lot of things wrong with it, and it is still by no means finished, even with the amount of work I've already done to this thing. The very week after I bought it, California decided to give us a really big rainstorm, and in the process showing me just how much all the rubber seals have shrunk and deteriorated. It was pretty odd, yet somehow hilarious when I opened the door after I just got off work to hear a tremendous amount of swishing and sloshing coming from inside the door. There we go. I'll just let that sit for a minute. The doors were full of water, and the trunk was converted into a mobile swimming pool. I think that's when I realized that there was a lot more work to be done to it before I can consider it perfect. The first mod I did was when I replaced the old and rusty, warped and cracked cast iron exhaust manifold with a set of long tube headers from MSA. Driving that thing with an exhaust leak as bad as it was infuriating because it almost covered the sound of the engine. That's how bad it was. I remember this job absolutely kicking my ass simply because of the 10mm bolts that hold the two heat shield to the underside of the intake manifold and to the top side of the exhaust manifold. I think it took me just about 2 hours of just removing those bolts, one little micro turn at a time with a stubby wrench. There's barely any room between those two manifolds to get a wrench in there or socket or anything. It was miserable. My back was hurting all night after that. After a long day, I finally did get the new manifold in there and had it all back together, fired up, and that thing sounded mean. We have a welder at the shop, but for some reason I couldn't get the ground cable to make a proper connection, so I decided to just drive the car to the local exhaust shop. I can't tell you how much fun it was to be driving a bone stock Z with open headers around town like that. I gotta say, I don't think I've ever heard an L28 sound that amazing before. It almost sounded like a Chevy V8 because of the unequal length runners dumping right at your feet. Super cool. I wish I could recreate it again without using a Sawzall. After that, I focused a little bit more on creature comfort mods and quality of life improvements, such as beginning my restoration on the interior, starting with the interior panels in the trunk. I gotta say, I am not at all a fan of cardboard-backed panels that old cars used to have. It really made it difficult to repair what was left of 40-year-old cardboard that also just happened to be soaked when it was introduced to a heavy rainstorm for the first time in the car's life. But I got it done, and I'm still pretty proud of the result, especially considering that it's still holding up to this day. Unfortunately, the tail panel has since acquired a couple of new holes from things sliding around in the trunk. I only wonder who's to blame for that one. Wasn't me. On the 280ZX's front suspension, there's a component called the radius arm, sometimes referred to as the torque arms. I don't really know what the correct name is, I hear a lot of different versions, but whatever they're called, there's those rods that bolt to the outer corners of the lower control arms and pivot off of the front subframe via bushings. Their job is to control the caster angle, especially under braking. And I think this is my least favorite part about this car's suspension design. It was really difficult to find replacements, and when I did, I must have gotten a really old bad pair or something. Almost immediately, they too began cracking and falling apart. Within a year, they were worse than the originals. Super disappointing is an understatement. I decided to upgrade to polyurethane bushings, which is an upgrade that I've heard on forums is actually not recommended for these cars. On those radius arms, torque arms, I don't know, whatever they call thingies, since the stiffer bushings put way too much stress on the arms and actually cause them to break. Well, it's been a couple of years since, and I still have yet to report any issues. One of the best mods that I've done so far is upgrading the cooling system. Similar to the exhaust manifold, it was an upgrade that I decided to do because old parts were beyond repair. The original 40-year-old carburetor finally began springing some leaks, and all the local radiator shops kept quoting me stupid amounts of money to repair it. One shop quoted me $700 to repair an old crappy radiator. I quickly said never mind and decided to just upgrade to a Champion triple-core aluminum radiator along with dual 11-inch electric fans, all for just about the same price. I'm super glad I chose to upgrade. The new cooling system is ridiculously good. There it is. In December of 2023, I drove it 500 miles to my best friend's house in Tucson, Arizona, all the way from Upland, California. I did the same drive in the same car the year prior, and it handled the drive way better than last time. I could literally watch the temperature gauge fall when going down the steeper hills in the Californian valleys. Continuing with the engine vitals, one of the few drawbacks about the L28 engine is the oiling system, and more specifically the oil pressure. According to the factory service manual, Nissan wants this engine to idle at just 7 psi. 7. I'm sure the engineers back in the day knew what they were doing considering just how good the engine is, but to me, I just can't sleep at night knowing that they want anything less than 10 psi. I decided that I wanted some sleep, so I found and bought a brand new high volume oil pump that came factory on the cars that were turbocharged. It was a really easy swap to do since it's all factory parts. The only modification that I had to make there was to swap back in the regulator spring from the old pump to the new pump because it was exceeding 90 psi at only 2500 RPM. Way too much. Now it idles a very happy 15 psi and doesn't go over 85 psi at 3000 RPM. Perfect. Here's the before video. And 1000 RPM and it's still below the line. Warm, of course. That's before. And here is after. You can see same RPM, same temperature, and a much better oil pressure. Check that out. This was almost the third case of me upgrading because of old parts, because on hot days, I would see the low pressure warning light come on when it returned to idle at a stop sign. The low pressure warning light, by the way, doesn't come on until only 5 psi. Ridiculous. Another thing I swapped over from my turbo car is a combination oil pressure and temperature gauge. I don't really have a need for it, but I always thought it was super cool to have 2 gauges in one little pod. So I looked at the wiring diagrams to see if I can retrofit it, and quickly discovered that not only is it possible, but it's really easy. The 3 center gauges in the 280ZXs are actually kind of modular, which makes sense because they had to make different gauges fit into the same cluster pod, such as a mechanical clock versus a digital clock, a battery voltage gauge versus a turbo boost gauge, and a standard oil pressure gauge versus a combination pressure and temperature gauge. Even with the different gauges, the circuit board that they all connect to is the same, even on the different trim models. It couldn't be any more plug and play than that. So I designed, machined, and welded my own bung that goes into the side of the oil pan to accept the new oil temperature sensor. From there, it was as simple as running a single wire through the firewall and into the back of the gauge cluster connector, and swapping the two gauges over. I love the little simple modifications like this because I'm upgrading while still using factory parts. With this being my daily driver, along with something that I actually like to beat on every once in a while, bad things are bound to happen. Dents, dings, and scratches that weren't there before now are. Luckily, I've yet to get anything that I would consider anything more than minor. So far, the worst thing that's happened was when I run over a tumbleweed on the freeway, creating an exhaust leak right at the flange where the downpipe bolts up to the catalytic converter. It sounds terrible, and I've still yet to actually do anything about it.
Who knew a tumbleweed can be that hard? Sheesh. Fucking thing sounds like...
I tried retorquing the bolts to see if I can suck the flanges back together, but nah, it's too far apart. I will fix it eventually though, but only because I want to redo the exhaust anyways. It's not high on my priority list, so it'll have to wait. The biggest and most recent thing that I did to this thing was completely restoring the interior with all new carpet and a full sound and thermal insulation install. Everything from the firewall to the taillights is covered top to bottom with some kind of insulation. The whole process took about a week, from completely gutting the whole car on Monday to bolting the seat back in for the last time on Saturday, which as of the time we're recording this is yesterday. It all turned out exceptionally well, and I couldn't be happier with the result. It looks, sounds, and even smells like a brand new car. With me only having the one car to drive, I had to bolt the seat back in at the end of each day and drive it home and pretend like it was a race car with how gutted it was. I began to really enjoy that really large exhaust leak that was located directly below my right hand, as listening to an essentially open-header L28 screaming at 5,000 plus RPM was addicting, especially on deceleration. I'm beginning to change my mind and thinking that redoing the exhaust is moving up in my priority list. I have done a lot of work to this thing, even more than what I've mentioned here today. And as I said before, there is still a lot more to be done in the future. The 280ZX is often referred to as the worst of the vintage Z cars because of how it strayed from being a simple sports car to more of a luxury-focused touring car. Part of me agrees, and I will always prefer the look of the classic 280Z over the 280ZX. However, I truly believe that the 280ZX is underrated as hell. Having a car that combines the sportiness of the Z car with the luxuriousness of some other cars is a really nice treat to have. For what it is, it handles really well, looks amazing, and is really fun to burn gasoline in, and overall just have a good time with. Just about every time I make a stop somewhere, whether it be at a gas station or restaurant, I almost always get stopped by somebody quickly mentioning to me how they used to have one or they knew somebody who had one and praise it for how cool it was back in the day. I love my 280ZX, and I ask those who think negatively about it to reconsider. So what's next for my little old Z? Well, mainly cosmetic stuff. I want to redo the exhaust, fix the dents and dings, redo the seats, redo the dashboard, and probably repaint the car, either in the same color or in a more modern gunmetal gray that the newer Nissans use. The biggest thing that I'd like to do is replace the entire fuel injection and ignition system over to a modern standalone unit. The current ECU and engine management systems are beginning to really show their age, and I really think it would be fun to bring this great old engine into the 21st century, maybe even picking up a little power in the process. This likely won't happen for a while though, as it isn't a cheap swap. Luckily, Nissan made it really easy to do though, since the entire ECU, fuel injection system, and ignition system are practically standalone as it is. They're entirely separate from the rest of the car and all connected to one harness. Maybe someday. Making more horsepower is something that I want to do, but I'm really not interested in making anything more than 250. I'd like to keep it closer to its stockish, luxury-focused roots. If I ever get a classic 280Z, oh, you bet I'm going to make that thing a race car. But the 280ZX, this is the more calm version in my mind. Alright, well, I think that just about does it for this one. I don't want to keep rambling. Thanks for sticking around, and I hope you enjoy learning a little bit more about my car with me. Thanks. See you later.